Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. When Neal Adams passed away on April 28th, I felt compelled to put together a series of memorial webinars. And here we are on what would have been his 15th birthday, his 81st birthday on June 15th. I started out with the work that made his bones, Dead Man. Continued on with his incredible body of Batman works, which had to be split up into two. Of course, starting in 1970, his Green Lantern, Green Arrow series with Denny O'Neil. And then his Marvel works, the foundations really of the Marvel universe of today. And then his Superman body of work culminating in Superman versus Muhammad Ali, which he considered his greatest work. And what does that leave us with? It leaves us with what I call Neal Adams ECLECTICA. Some of his greatest works that I have not shown previously in this webinar that fill up, of course, a part one. If you look at the images in the collage, you'll see a bit of what we'll cover tonight. And my name, folks, is Arlen Schumer. I did a book about comic book art in the 1960s called The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, about the artists whose work defined the 60s themselves and the transformation of the superheroes. Each artist got their own chapter, introduction like this, their portrait of their most iconic character. And then ghosted behind the type of my introduction is another type of autobiographical image. Here are some of Neal's most famous characters: Batman, the Spectre, Green Arrow, and Dead Man. There's one of Neal's spreads with Dead Man's giant psychedelic head on the right. And what's that on the left? That's Ben Casey, the comic strip that Neal Adams debuted on in 1962 when he was 21 years old, the youngest artist ever to be given a nationally syndicated daily and Sunday comic strip. And look at how he was covered in them. Neal is a bachelor, continued Mr. Lynn. He lives alone, works out of his Midtown Manhattan studio apartment, is a voracious coffee drinker and doesn't drink or smoke. He decided very early in life to become an artist, and he has never swerved from his ambition. In recent months, he regularly has visited university hospitals in New York and the New York Public Library reference rooms and has become completely absorbed in the Ben Casey story and character. And look at the photo reference that Neal used extensively in the art he was trained in, doing comic art for advertising, which is how he was selected to do Ben Casey. That's his adopted daughter, Chris, and his first wife, Corey, in the pictures there. And Neal posed as Ben Casey himself. You can see the resemblance he had to actor Vince Edwards, who played Casey in the ABC television series circa 1962 to 1966. I'm a little confused by this sort of red second color on this presentation piece, but these are pieces that not only did I not show in the very first Neal Adams overview webinar, but that goes for all the images I'm going to be showing you. But here are some prime examples of how not only was Neal learning while doing and doing beautifully, using all the tools of black and white comic strip and adding to it the dimensions of zipatone in the center panel. Those are a series of tiny dots printed on acetate that the artist would cut out with an X-Acto knife and paste down where he wanted it. But you can see how all the figures are taken from photo reference, and the fine line work of Adams inking, which is what you'll see is what he brought to basically mainstream superhero comics, but in these beautiful Ben Casey examples. And by the way, I even know what these stories are about, because to me, Ben Casey is only about the art, and Neal Adams' kind of training ground. But, you know, talk about learning on the job. How about that beautiful explosion in the left panel and the use of zipatone and the different line textures that Adams would experiment with, that he got from studying the history of the black and white comic strip and the Alex Raymond influenced realistic style. Look at this promo piece for the debut of the Sunday. Now, the daily started in 1962. I'm not sure what year this September 20th debut of the Sunday page is. Now, the Sunday page in those days had to be written and designed to fit into multiple formats. And, you know, the coloring in many of these was nothing special. I'm not sure if Neal did the coloring in these, but you can see, like in the second panel at the top, the interesting second panel, beautifully drawn. And look at the center panel of the middle-aged man and that classic lighting. These are all things that Neal employed in every one of these strips, again, to a high degree. How about the close-up of the eye, which would become almost a Neal trademark that he would use years later in his comic book work? And how about this sample I have only in black and white, but Neal is pushing at the boundaries artistically and graphically of what he can do in either a daily comic strip like I showed back in my overview webinar, or look at how the shape of the diver in the second tier right continues the shape of the gun from the top panel. I mean, that's a little thing of beauty there. Talk about a thing of beauty. How about this panel? The standout panel in this particular Sunday configuration from 1965. And it's that type of graphic expressiveness that Neal would, of course, later bring to his comic book work. After Ben Casey ended in 1966, along with the TV show being taken off the air, Neal went in other directions as a freelance illustrator in New York City, some of which I showed in the first overview webinar. But here's an example of a daily and Sunday syndicated strip that he pitched. This is the promotion piece that I only have this black and white version of. But once again, you can see the highly photo referenced background, figures and characters. It was obviously a strip about a family that worked construction, I don't know, for the government or something like that. Again, to me, the so-called stories are inconsequential. It's all about noticing Neal the craftsman, Neal the artist. Look at the middle tier on the left and that close-up of the eye, and Neal posing for the character himself in that shot in this with the center character. So this has to be circa 1966, 67. 67 is the year that he went over to Warren Comics, which were doing, of course, the black and white horror magazines. And working with the writer Archie Goodwin, Neal did a series of stories in 1967, with each one being a different black and white art technique. So Fair Exchange is pretty standard pen and ink with zipatone textures. The Terror Beyond Time, I think, uses a wash approach for its gray tones. Voodoo Drum uses a grease pencil technique. Oh, I'm sorry if I went too fast there. And there's Neil posing, or I think he had a friend, Ken, I forget his last name, that posed for the guy, although Neil himself had a goatee at the time. A Curse of Claws. Now this technique, yeah, I guess he was using, again, these other textures. Interesting silhouette choice, the white silhouette in the bottom right. And then, of course, Curse of the Vampire, the first of Neil's great Dracula stories. This one, beautiful wash tones. Man, again, so much of this early art is just studying the artwork. But of course, in Eclectica Part 2 next week, you'll see the fruition of his Dracula oeuvre with his classic black and white gray tone story and Dracula Lives #2, circa 1973 or 4. And then there was the mid-60s advertising comics that Neil did pretty much all through the 60s, in between his comic strip work and his comic book work. Neil never really stopped doing comics for advertising. You can see this had to be from that mid-60s era, Neil's pen work at the time. This is very Dead Man-ish, I would say. But, you know, the beautiful coloring on the right page and that psychedelic first panel, I mean, that's as good as anything from Neil's prime era. So again, these are random pieces. I'm not sure if they're seen this way, but for the sake of brevity, I've grouped them as such. You know, this looks like it was from, you know, a different project, but once again, you can see the high level of craftsmanship that Neil would put into all of his artwork that you'll see, especially in this Eclectica. This looks like earlier 1960s Neil, but it's the super heroic approach that Neil brought to his art that obviously attracted the Aurora model company based out of West Hempstead, Long Island. They made great model kits. This is a promotional comic book placed ad. They did sports figures. You can see planes, ships, monster models, and with the Superman model, you can see there on the right. I think that was their first superhero model, circa 1964. Interesting that the box cover art was a painting. I forget the name of the artist. I think George something. But obviously the character looks based on more on George Reeves than on the Kurt Swan Superman, the baby boomer Superman artist, with this back cover ad that DC placed, which was, of course, different for the next superhero in line, which is Batman. At least they got Carmine Infantino, the great Batman artist of the 1960s. Interesting, you know, the models never quite looked like the artwork from the cover, but at least they got Infantino to do the art for the box cover as well, unlike the Superman model. Starting in 67, they introduced a couple of Marvel characters, Spider-Man, the Hulk, and Captain America. I mean, I was a kid. I was 9 years old. My brother was 10 and a half. We bought a million of these. We'd make them. We wouldn't. These are recent shots of people who really know how to paint models. We would mess them up, blow them up with firecrackers, melt them, whatever. But why am I showing you this? Well, here's the box cover to Spider-Man. You know, it took me years until I realized, holy crap, that's Neal Adams. Yes, folks. I remember staring at the shade and going, I've never seen Spider-Man. So I don't know if I use the word realistically drawn. Again, I was 9 years old. But yes, this was a Neal Adams freelance illustration job. The Hulk model, which looked like this, that's the box cover. And yes, that's not Jack Kirby. That is a piece of Neal Adams commercial artwork done in the style of early Kirby Hulk. There's a circa 1968 ad. No, I'm sorry, 1966. By Aurora, placed on the backs of comic books or the inside back covers. And what do you see there next to Batman? Robin. Remember the Robin model? Oops. Let's take a look at that a little longer. Yeah. None of the ones no Robin model I ever had, and I had them all, ever came out looking like that. But nevertheless, once again, the cover by Neal Adams. Neal Adams doing his best Dick Sprang Robin. It's like a Dick Sprang Robin head with a realistic Neal Adams body. But again, folks, it took me years, if not decades, before I realized that that was early Neal Adams. So it was fate, kismet. It had to be that Neal would eventually, by 1967, wind up at DC Comics in the company of veteran editors like the great late Julius Schwartz, who was editing the Batman titles, among many other DC superheroes. And he quickly, as in February 68, which means this came out in November of 67, which means Neal probably drew it in the summer of 67. Early, kind of awkward Batman, but you can see the realism in terms of body physics, action, and motion in this very first Batman cover for Julius Schwartz. But Schwartz immediately put him on his own title, The Spectre. Oh, are you kidding me? We all love Murphy Anderson's Spectre. This is December of 67. I was such a Spectre fan. I love the fact that DC gave the Spectre his own title. I love Murphy Anderson. And we were all stunned and shocked, not only by this cover, but by the interior artwork. Now, the late, great art critic Robert Hughes coined the phrase, the shock of the new. This is the early Neal artwork that turned off a lot of people who were fans of Murphy Anderson's Spectre. But as you look at this early Neal superhero art, he's doing this a little bit before even Dead Man. You can see that he still brought his trademark graphic virtuosity to the Spectre. I mean, Murphy Anderson didn't draw the Spectre in poses like this. It was like a realistic Spectre we hadn't seen before. But then Neal Adams, the graphic artist, would throw in panels like the bottom left that were very interesting. And then how about this page? Again, thanks, DC, for your technique of splitting up a narrative with an ad. That's, of course, by the great Kurt Schaffenberger, but still, I mean, it's one thing to go to a commercial, but to share the narrative with a commercial is really pathetic. But the idea of the Spectre getting in bed with Jim Corrigan, as illustrated by Neal Adams, was certainly, I remember we were shocked by the new. We had never seen anything drawn like this quite before. And how about this feature? DC Comics had never done anything like this. We didn't even know who Neal Adams was. And here's a full page dedicated supposedly to the Spectre interviewing Neal Adams. Now, I worked for Neal in the mid-1980s. I wish I had asked him, Neal, was this your idea or was it Julius Schwartz's idea? Because, you know, the EC comics of the early 50s are beloved in part because they put the artist up front like this. This is the inside front cover. And that's how the fans of VC were rabid, because they knew the artists behind the art. And Neal, who was, 10, 11 years old when this stuff was coming out, I'm going to bet dollars to donuts he came up with this idea. And when you actually read it, I mean, I'm going to assume, again, Neal wrote this, but it's pretty witty. It's pretty funny, but it revealed to an audience that not only didn't know him, but was begrudgingly resentful that Murphy Anderson wasn't drawing the Spectre. And I mean, look at what the right column says. With all that stuff, how could you possibly find time to do the Spectre? That's funny. That's exactly what Julius Schwartz said to me the other day as he stood behind me at my drawing board, jingling the loose changes pocket. That's Neal, the great writer. Doesn't that just paint the perfect picture? Neal used to work up at the national offices. That's why he churned out so much of the work you're going to see here. He didn't work at home. He liked going to the office and working there and getting to know the business of DC Comics. Anyway, we could spend all day reading this incredible feature, but how about this sketch that had to be from that era? You could tell if you study Neal's signature, what's from, the 60s and then the 70s and then his modern signature. But about the same time, Neal drew this cover for this third issue, his second issue of the Spectre. And folks, this was the issue that I recall making everybody who resented issue 2 to fall in love, I believe. At least it was for me. And I've talked to people, this was the issue really artistically that began to blow our socks off about who is this Neal Adams guy. And I mean, right from the start, you can feel those punches, the dynamism. Now, who was Wildcat? And why am I showing you this 1940 circa, maybe 41, created by Irwin Hazen Luke and printed credit for the co-creator of Batman, Bill Finger, who also co-created Green Lantern and so many other DC Comics characters and stories. But he was brought back along with so many other of the golden age 1940s characters in the mid-60s by editor Julius Schwartz and artist Murphy Anderson. This is from November of 1965, the summer of 65, when Murphy Anderson illustrated all these classic golden age revivals. So here is the vision of Wildcat by Murphy Anderson, 3 years before Neal Adams' version. And this is beginning to show you that you're going to see all through this webinar just how different Neal's art was from what had come immediately before him, which again, we all love Murphy Anderson. But look at the difference in the dynamism, the excitement that Neal brought to mainstream superhero comic art, just everything from the panel layout and the physics of motion and how to cartoon it with motion lines, speed lines. How about this page? Beautiful lettering. I think that was Irish Snap. I don't think that's Neal, but look at the black and white line art that Neal did for the Spectre coming out of the clouds. Very biblical in a way, but the Spectre is a biblical type figure. And yet Neal drew him with a realism that we just had never seen before. Who would position a superhero like this and pull it off and make it work and make you feel that scene? And in the same issue, Neal also blew our socks off with his version of the interworldly, otherworldly dimensions of the Spectre. And beautiful panels like this. And then at the same time, bring it down to a human realistic level with final panels like this. And remember the ad in the bottom of the page? But wait a second. That's by Neal Adams too. This is the spring of 1968, the 200th issue of Batman. And yep, Carmine Infantino had stopped drawing Batman to become an executive. And basically Neal Adams became, in 68, DC's de facto superstar cover artist. I mean, this is a 1968 piece of DC promotional art. And that shows you that Adams had been anointed by none other than the head of the Superman family line, the major domo of DC Comics, Mort Weisinger, who, as I showed you in last week's Superman Ali webinar, and I showed you the body of the Superman work he did before he did Superman Ali. But Kurt Swan had been the cover artist of Weisinger's Superman entire line for the previous 10 straight years. Now, this is his last issue, January of 68. Neal Adams would take over like Weisinger put him on every one of his superhero titles and began turning out covers that looked like this. This is 3 issues later, spring of 68. The reason why I'm showing you this particular cover is to show you this rejected cover sketch, whether it was rejected by Weisinger or by Neal himself. It just shows you the talk about different perspectives that Neal would take all of us fans on for, you know, the next 10 years of DC Comics and other companies, of course, as well. So instead, we got this cover, which seems humdrum in comparison. Then there was the DC editor, Murray Boltinoff, who began to give Neal work. Later on in 68, he would, of course, allow Neal to draw his Brave and Bold Batman team-up title, which I went into in depth in the Batman Memorial webinar. But one of the other titles that Boltinoff edited was DC's Western title, Tomahawk, which by late 67 was being drawn by journeyman artist Bob Brown in covers that looked like this. Well, maybe Boltinoff had seen one of Neal's many Western drawings like this one. I'm not sure where this comes from, what its provenance was, what it was originally used for, but if you study the tradition of great American Western art, one of the major artists, Charles M. Russell, along with Frederick Remington, are considered the great American Western artists. And maybe Boltinoff saw this connection and said, Neal, how about doing some covers for Tomahawk? So this is issue 115, April of 68. Tomahawk was a bi-monthly title. The last cover by Bob Brown, starting with the next issue and continuing until late 1970. Neal would do a series of just incredibly beautiful Western pieces as Tomahawk covers. And again, look at the influence of Charles M. Russell and the vitality in this horse drawing that you can see in Neal's as well. What a contrast. You open up the cover and this is the interior artwork. So this would begin again a tradition of Neal doing covers where, you know, we bought them just for the covers alone because they were so brilliant. And along with the series of Tomahawk covers you're going to see through the course of this webinar, there's also an unpublished cover that just shows you how much Neal loved drawing horses. I mean, whether this was a rejected cover or just never finished or I don't know what, but man, what a beauty. So back to the Spectre. We're in June of 68. I'm keeping in chronology here. So here is Neal's third issue. And what makes this particular issue different and unique is that what? Story and art by Neal Adams? So not only was this guy beginning to blow our minds, but as I went into in the Marvel Works webinar, Neal was greatly influenced to write and draw his own stuff at DC by what the great Jim Steranko was doing over at Marvel, starting earlier, a year ago in '67. But this is June of '68. This is the same month that Neal would debut writing and drawing a story for DC Comics and using many of the same techniques that we were seeing at what Steranko was blowing our minds with over at Marvel. But here's another issue where Neal is stretching artistically. I'm assuming, as you're going to see with a lot of the great coloring in these issues, it was Neal's decision to fill in the panel borders. He only did it for this issue and maybe one other. But once again, you can see that Neal is starting to really get funky with the Spectre. And Neal's dynamism on the comic page, sucking you into a scene like this that felt like a widescreen epic. And then there was, again, the kind of psychedelia. Remember, folks, this is right in the heart of the psychedelic era in American art, 1968. And Neal's giving us panels that are wild. And I just love the classic Ben-Day dot coloring and the stylization of it. And at the same time, you know, from superheroes to Westerns, Neal gave us this Tomahawk cover next. Neal's artwork at this time period is also just a study in black and white, pen and ink, and brush-based inking in a photorealistic manner, although there's just as much cartooning, quote unquote, in these images as in anything. August of '68, Neal's next Spectre. Great dynamic cover. And once again, story and art by Neal Adams. And more interesting coloring, and you can see the way Neal planned out the black and white art, where you would treat panels like this for the colorist to tell them what to do and to add the color to its own plate, which is printer lingo for another webinar. And this double page spread, man, you talk about widescreen. I mean, that just burst off the page. There's the best black and white I could find, but man, Neal loved drawing dinosaurs, and it shows. And just again, the widescreen feel of this art presages a decade later, Neal would do promotional art. I think this is for Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, I believe. But yeah, it just shows that Neal was able to make you feel like you were watching a movie on the comic book page. So at the same time he's doing dinosaurs, he's doing gargoyles for DC Comics, which would inaugurate an era of horror comics covers when DC Comics decided to let Joe Orlando resuscitate DC Comics mystery and horror comics line. And Neal was basically his cover artist for the next 4 years or so of really just one incredible cover that pushes the bounds of comic book cover coloring, as I'm going to demonstrate in transformative dimensions like this to show you the quality, the integrity, the beauty of what I assume is Neal's coloring. Neal worked with DC colorists Jack Adler, but the fact that DC's coloring takes a leap in sophistication when Neal comes on board is no accident. I believe all the great coloring you're going to see tonight in this webinar, I believe it's Neal, or it's Neal directing Jack Adler, Neal doing the color studies, giving them to Adler. Hardly anything exists. But man, there's his next House of Mystery cover, October of '68. And this theme, this running theme, whether Neal came up with it or editor Joe Orlando, of kids witnessing acts of horror and mystery and suspense, that's the running theme of all these covers. Lettering at the top by Gaspar Saladino, who basically replaced Ira Schnapp, who did all of DC's Silver Age logos. But there's Neal's first Justice League cover, November of '68. Now, how did he come to do this particular cover when inker, who rarely pencils and inks his own stuff, Joe Gella, had been doing the previous couple of covers? But man, when he handed this cover in for issue 66, maybe editor Schwartz looked at it and said, that is so horrible, I can't even print that. Maybe Neal saw it and said, Julie, let me do this cover for you. Again, we don't know the story. Neal never discussed it, but that's what ended up being the cover. A little bit of an awkward combination of cartoony general in the background, but whatever, that was Neal's first Justice League cover. The very next month, he would do a much more dynamic and iconic cover when he did this one of all the superheroes holding the classic burst paper. I love Wonder Woman at the top, just kind of hanging out, letting the boys hold the piece while she just supervises. But man, Neal would end 1968 with one of his greatest mystery covers for House of Mystery, with just this beautiful coloring. But it starts out with the grease pencil technique of shading. And notice Neal's note at the top to Joe Orlando: thanks for letting me try it. Without delaying us too much in time, Neal would push to use these graphic techniques that he was familiar with from his background, but DC Comics and their production department were not. So every time you see one of these amazing covers that combine old school Ben-Day dot coloring with Neal's artistic techniques, you gotta just love it. And I mean, every month, this is still the month of December. So Neal is, remember, I'm showing you the stuff I didn't show you. At the same time Neal is turning out mini masterpieces like this, he's also doing covers for Weisinger's Superman line. He's doing Batman and Detective Comics covers, and who knows what else. I'm just showing you the best of everything else that Neal was turning out on a monthly basis. January of 1969 kicks off with this psychedelic cover. Now, Neal didn't do drugs. He didn't drink, I believe. But man, you know, he was right with the times, because the very next, same month, January of '69, he gives us this interdimensional kind of red mist. It looks like the Blob from the 1958 movie. So there it is in black and white. You can still see the white out and then the color. Now, of course, this interdimensional theme goes way back in comics. This is Carmine Infantino from the early 50s on the Phantom Stranger, a shadow-like character. But why am I showing you this particular interdimensional cover? Because the very next month, February of '69, DC Comics would bring back the Phantom Stranger because of this new rush of successful horror titles. And there's Neal Adams doing the cover. This particular cover started out with a drawing that looked like this. Again, whether Neil rejected it in favor of eventually doing this one, that was the one that was printed. Now, folks, if you want to see what beautiful coloring adds to beautiful black and white line work, just look at this beauty and how sensitively these colors are. I mean, this is not computer colors, folks. This is hand-cut screens that Neil is directing with his coloring. At the same time, he gives us this beauty, February of '69. And even better was an interior story drawn by Neil in pencil and just incredibly beautifully colored. One of Neil's greatest early DC art jobs. And once again, don't even ask me what the story is about. I read it years ago, but just look at the art and the stylized coloring. There's, I guess, zipatone effects, and he's using, you know, again, I think grease pencil on some things, but I just love the monochromatic panels. I wish more colorists would color comics that look like this. Man. I mean, just the panel design, everything about the art I'm showing you is just so beautiful and so classic. Yeah, once again, thanks, DC. You had to sell a third page of an ad. I mean, that should have been a full page panel, but nevertheless, here's Neil just being Mr. Eclectic. I mean, out of nowhere, you get DC still had a line of romance comic titles that they inherited in the late 50s. And there's Neil giving us a prime Neil romance cover. March of '69. Why am I showing you this? Ergo Novick. He was the Batman full-time artist at the time. This is before Neil started drawing Batman, but editor Schwartz must not have liked the Ergo Novick figure. And it looks like Neil, even for Neil, that's a pretty terrible leg. I mean, come on, Neil, but nevertheless, this was the cover that editor Schwartz went with. Anyway, April of '69. Why am I showing you a classic Nick Cardy cover for Teen Titans? He was the Teen Titan artist of the 1960s and early 70s. This particular story, while the cover was by Cardy, the interior was penciled by Neil and inked by Cardy. This character, Joshua, exists as this very beautiful pencil sketch by Neil. And you can see the dynamism of Neil's pencils even coming through the kind of heavy-handed, but, you know, I guess the idea was make it look like Cardy, but Cardy, I don't know what the circumstances were that Cardy didn't pencil this or Neil. There must be a background story. I think it's in some fanzine. But these webinars are about showing the artwork and not getting caught up in the story, because the artwork is just gorgeous. April of '69. How about that? Look at the way the original black and white was, where the horse, beautifully drawn horse. But again, whether Neil rejected this or editor Boltinoff, but you ended up with this masterpiece. So Neil was so versatile. The same month this came out, a Western, you got this incredible science fiction cover. After he stopped doing the Dead Man feature, they changed it to Adam's Strange Adventures, and Neil continued to do the covers. Now, the revolution in Neil's inking, you can see it in the figure here that, you know, artistically committing to that much black ink within a figure, you've got to really know where the highlights of light would be. And again, you could teach a class just in the inking of this cover alone, and then how it's realized in color and the decision to do the type that way in the background. It's really, again, interesting Neal cover. He starts doing a couple covers for the DC group that Bob Brown was drawing, Challengers of the Unknown, but interesting graphic dichotomy between the black and white gray panel as the telescreen and the color foreground. May of '69, why am I showing you an Irv Novick Raven Bold cover? Well, it's Batman teamed up with the Teen Titans. Neal drew the interior, of course. So in between the two Teen Titan issues, Neal draws the Batman Brave and Bold, because the very next month, it was a two-part story, and it was, again, penciled by Neal and inked by Carty. So once again, you can see the Neal Adams style coming through, the realism of the center figure, but the heavy-handed inks by Carty. You know, people like this art, they don't like the art. And once again, you can see, especially in the top panel, that's Neal's dynamism with Carty's inks. June of '69. Now, when you look at this cover, that's a pretty complex cover. I mean, look at what Neal planned in black and white. Now, this is a daunting challenge for any colorist, but I've got to believe Neal colored this one, because just look at the sense of design and how he clarifies everything. Beautiful edge lighting on the Adam Strange figure. And then once again, folks, from science fiction to romance, in the next month, you get this Neal Adams cover. By the way, I'll See You Dead Before I'll Let Anyone Else Have You. That's basically Little Girl by John Lennon. Run for your, or is it Run for Your Life If You Can, Little Girl? Catch You with Another Man. That's the end, Little Girl. Doesn't he have a line? I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to see you with another man. Anyway, I digress. The same month, talk about fear. In the Batman two-part webinars, I showed you plenty of incredible Batman and Detective Comics covers he did. But this is right before Neal starts drawing Batman on a semi-full-time frequency. But based on what he was doing in 1969 in the Brave and Bold title, that was the Batman that people were telling editor of Detective Julia Schwartz, why doesn't the Brave and Bold Batman look like the one in your Detective Comics? So he starts getting Neal to do covers like this. The very next month, switching genres, we're back to Tomahawk. Another beautifully colored cover. I love the strong pink skin, the yellow, oh man. Just each one of these is just a beauty, and Neal and horses. So DC's horror line in 1969 is flying high. So there's a Gaspar Saladino full-page house ad for the great Neal cover. And just really incredible. And they probably timed this to debut their second after House of Mystery. House of Secrets was transformed into a sister title, and Neal once again is doing the covers. And I mean, this one is pretty iconic. Another thing with children, but you get the incredible Neal Adams version of the haunt. I mean, man, the prison, the bars of the gate. They would, DC, all these horror titles, they would turn their kind of latent science fiction titles into horror titles. And by getting Gaspar Saladino to do the spooky lettering, it all fit into editor Joe Orlando's body of horror-related titles, with Neal doing all these covers. So once again, Neal starts out with a black and white original, painstakingly inked like this. And I mean, that's just a beautiful color scheme. I just love the purples in the dungeon background. And just look at the subtleties of the blues and the greens in the ghostly foreground figure. And then very next month, back to Tomahawk. Whoops. Every time I hit the keyboard, it's so sensitive. But man, the Zipatone gray background gives this cover dimension. And I mean, they still had to stick the Bob Brown Tomahawk head on top there. But man, who cares? It's just another beauty. And you know, a lot of these covers, I'm a 10-year-old buying DC comics. I never saw these where I bought comics. I never noticed Tomahawk and the war titles. I was such a superhero zombie, I guess. But man, here's an Alice in Wonderland type image. Neil's black and white original. Now, folks, I'm showing you the best black and white version I can find, but I love the fact you can see the white out on these originals. There's Neil's signature at the bottom. And just again, a beautiful coloring job. Look at the tones of the attic rafters. Tones of brown. Now, at around this time, this black and white pencil drawing exists of looks like a proposed cover. I don't know who rejected it, but it looks like maybe this might have been an early version of what became this similar attic cover. Again, there's no record of interview where Neil discusses any of this. Meanwhile, back to the Phantom Stranger, issue 3 features this Neil cover. And man, doesn't that look like England's Doctor Who? One of the early Doctor Who's in the background. I mean, look at the Phantom Stranger and the logo, and then look at the guy Neil draws on the horse. But it's another grease pencil effect, I think, that Neil uses. And just look at how much the sensitive coloring brings to an image like this. I mean, it's really phenomenal. I mean, Neil is just churning out these covers monthly, along with so much of other work. By the way, folks, this is years before The Ring, right? With the girl that comes out of the TV. This is November of 1960, right? We're in 1969. Meanwhile, he's drawing X-Men over Marvel Comics, and November of 69 brings Marvel's horror comic, Tower of Shadows, with this John Romita cover of what looks like a couple of those hippies, right? Who would realize that this would be a story? Once again, Neal Adams writing and drawing. Only Jim Steranko was writing and drawing his own stuff. And of course, Stan Lee always put his name first, even when he probably had nothing to do with it. But the fact that this black and white original exists with what looks like gray wash tones, maybe this was a story Neil intended for Warren, and maybe Warren rejected it, who knows? And Neil sold it to Marvel. Once again, I don't know if there's a backstory to Neil's first published Marvel story with his writer and artist credit. But once again, without going into too much of what the story's about, just notice the artwork. And Neil, only Neil can draw hippies at the time, as you know, they really looked. And there's Neil's gift for realistic anatomy. I mean, those two figures of the woman in the top right are something only Neil would pull off and even attempt. And I mean, just look at, you know, feet and sandals. That's pretty difficult to draw, folks. And then you get this climax. I mean, artistically, it's nothing great, but again, this is Neal Adams Eclectica. And this is the stuff he's doing. The very next month, he ends 1969 with his only Phantom Stranger illustrated story after that awesome cover. Now, I think, once again, folks, There are no credits for this story. And I believe some of the inks are by the DC journeyman artist, Bill Drought. So when you look at some of these pages, I don't know if that's Neal's inking. I think it's Bill Drought. But then I'm going to show you other pages that look like Neal's inks. Now, Phantom Stranger is squaring off against this dragon-like character with wings. Now, it's interesting because back at Marvel a couple months earlier, he did this two-part story debuting the character Sauron, who squares off against the Angel in these awesome panels. And then 2 months later at DC, he's kind of continuing the theme with this. So very interesting. Anyway, later in the story, this is what I mean. These look like Neal's inks, especially when you look at them in black and white. That is not Bill Drought in that top right panel. And the fact that Neal signed it down below, that looks like Neal's pencils and inks. Nice coloring too. And then you get this full page masterpiece, especially in black and white. Once again, folks, that ain't Bill Drought. That's NEAL ADAMS. And the only other inker that brought the same level of cross-hatching and you know, careful inking was Tom Palmer. But man, these full pages by Neal, and just beautiful coloring too. Look at the different tones in the foreground of the hands and shadow, just beautiful. And then facing this page on the right, how about that panel of Phantom Stranger at the bottom and the woman and the coloring? And like I said, folks, you know, this webinar might go on a little long because I can't help but just, and I hope you're right along with me, oogling and ogling these pages. Yeah, so maybe Bill Drought starts inking the first few pages, but by the end of the story, I mean, that's Neal and all of his subtle beauty. Now, this panel, folks, this is the end of 1969. About a year later, Neal would do this mini masterpiece of a panel in 1970 that I showed in the Batman webinar. But look at the way he ends this Phantom Stranger story. And we have the black and white original. Ah, beautiful silhouette panel and that top. And just when you match it with beautiful coloring. Speaking of beautiful coloring, that month's Tomahawk, December of '69, is just another masterpiece in a string. Folks, I think I'm going to back up what I promised you. If you've never seen these Tomahawk covers, I hope you're enjoying them. And then, like I said, the same month, Neal is knocking out covers like this using printing techniques called color holds, where you draw the black and white art on a separate layer and give it to the printer and say, printer, print this black plate on your blue plate at 70%, and then print it on your yellow plate at 30%, or whatever the markups are. But you can see that NEAL ADAMS, the graphic experimentalist, at the same time, this is February of 1970 now, is experimenting with these color holds that he used often, or just great coloring like this Tomahawk cover. And just, I mean, the flesh tones and the highlights and making the backgrounds recede. Just, you don't see coloring like this back then and not today. I like this theme of the kids discovering this devil-like figure in what seems like a dimensional portal. So the very next month over in House of Secrets, again, a different take on a similar theme with the devil-like figure coming in from another dimension. So DC debuts another horror title, 12 o'clock, The Witching Hour, and issue 7 is Neil's first cover. Not necessarily one of his best, but nevertheless. Meanwhile, back at Challengers of the Unknown, Neil loved drawing animals in positions you can't necessarily find photo reference for, but just another beautifully colored cover as well. So here's another animal cover the same month. Now, Neil's use of negative space, the white as the ground, really sets off the figures, the coloring. It's also Neil's subtle take on an old Carmen Infantino 1966 Detective Comics cover, but it again shows you the difference in the DC Comics art that preceded Neil. At the time, this is the height of DC Comics superhero art, a Carmen Infantino Batman cover. But look at the depth of realism that Neil brought to superhero comics. And the dog there is just as realistically, sensitively drawn as any of the people in this image. And then same month, why not science fiction? In a way, this was Neil's, again, a subtle retake of an old Murphy Anderson wash cover with Jack Adler doing the wash tones. I mean, that's a beautiful Murphy Anderson, Jack Adler cover, circa 1963. So Neil does his take on it. And would you believe, the same month, March of 1970, just another masterpiece, another Western beauty. I think the lettering by Gaspar Saladino is a little oppressive, but some people think it works. But man, again, this is possibly Neil's homage to an early 50s Western cover, space Western, but just the concept of space Western. Remember Cowboys and Aliens of a couple years ago? Well, there's that cover. So we're in March of 1970. Why am I showing you this April of 1970 creepy cover painted by Frank Frazetta, of course? Well, in the frontispiece, the story behind the story of Rock God, written by Arlen Ellison. He had written the story based on the Frazetta painting, which came first. He wrote Rock God based on the Frazetta painting. And it was published, I believe, in 1969 in some science fiction pulp magazine. But then Ellison wrote, or somehow it got to Neal Adams. And you can see in these portraits, Adams goes, I guess I'm really 3 different people. A quiet, serious student of good literature and art. Also a guy who loves to draw pictures and convey ideas through the comic medium. The third Adams produces storyboards for television, illustrations for New York ad agencies. Someday, all 3 of us will work on a project we'll all enjoy. Interesting, huh? But Rock God is another of Neil's black and white, gray tone masterpieces. It's only a 6-page story. And I'm really only showing you a couple of the highlights. First of all, there is the first page in its original form with the paste ups. But Neil's vision of Ellison's Rock God via Frank Frazetta is just pretty awesome to behold. Even on a black and white magazine page, it just seems to burst at the boundaries. Now, remember I told you it was previously published in a science fiction magazine with illustrations by the great William Stout. And yet, look at Stout's Rock God as just another comparison to what Neil brought to comic art. I mean, again, it feels like a widescreen movie. That is the power of Neil's art at this time. And he was doing it in black and white with tones At the same time, he's at DC doing these Phantom Stranger covers with these psychedelic color holds. Neil's take on the classic Headless Horseman. But remember, Neil loves drawing horses. How about that offbeat composition on a weird diagonal, a Dutch angle, as they call it. And by the way, Neil loved the color green. It's one of the recurring color themes of some of his greatest covers, green. I'm sure I've shown a bunch of green color. There was a green tomahawk cover. I should have pointed it out then. So in May of 1970, this particular Witching Hour cover gives us the rare Neal Adams interior story for the horror comics. Up until now, he's only been doing covers. So that was just the introduction. It takes us into this 5-page story, which, again, I don't think, you know, Neil wrote. I think this is one of their writers, Jack Olick or somebody, but you can tell that Neil's decision to do very straightforward panel layouts tells you he's following a script. But even in this rather conventional storytelling, you get some nice coloring, nice graphics with the silhouette panel, the great headshot of the old man in the upper left and the woman. I love the red coloring, just the rich, old school Ben-Day dot coloring. Again, just Neil, the master illustrator at work here. The penultimate page has the characters answering the door that was ringing in the beginning. With the little girl, she gives them a drawing, and this is the drawing on the facing page. And it's interesting that Neil would end the story with this really incredible, sensitive, Frankenstein-esque pencil drawing, which brings us kind of full circle to the very first page with the shambling Hulk in the upper right panel. Once again, folks, the very next month, back in Tomahawk, beautifully colored cover with a black man in the center, Native Americans, white men, just beautiful composition and just incredible, beautiful coloring. But then he could turn around in the same month and give us a cover like this. You would never know this was Neal Adams, except when you look at the figures in the bottom right, you go, yeah, that's Neil. So Neil, I wish I knew more about his time at DC. Maybe he just said, hey, let me do a cover for Hot Wheels. Those faces are by the great Alex Toth, who was drawing the interiors. Neil was an Alex Toth fan, like every artist was. Did I ever? Yeah, how about that cover? Same month, folks. Look at the variation. In the same month of June 70, he gives us this cover with the moon for Phantom Stranger. And then over in House of Mystery, not only is it one of Neil's greatest House of Mystery covers, but we are blessed by another incredible Neal Adams interior. This particular story, Nightmare, again, I'm not sure who wrote it. Neil might have written it, or maybe it was by some Marv Wolfman or Len Wein, but again, it's really not important. I want you to study the coloring and just every dimension of the artwork, from the penciling to the inking. And while we don't have any tight pencils, we're blessed to have in existence these thumbnail drawings, which are like, this is probably a quarter the size of a quarter of an 8.5 by 11 piece of Xerox paper. That's how small Neil's full page thumbnails are. But you can see in the thumbnail how much of the gesture of the original drawing remains by the time you get to the beautiful finished art. The first 5 pages of the story, we happen to have Neil's thumbnail sketches. Again, this is probably a quarter of an 8.5 by 11. So basically Neil would thumbnail out 4 pages of comics on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper by dividing it into 4 equal quadrants. And then what we're missing, of course, is the type pencil and then the inked version. But at least we have those beautiful thumbnails. Neil's daughter, Chris Adams, at the time was the model for the little girl in the story. So Neil is literally drawing from life at the time. But man, these thumbnails are just mini masterpieces of composition and teaching tools for young artists to learn from. Beautiful, sensitive panel in the bottom right. But even in the thumbnail, you could see it's there. All the essentials of the composition are there in the tiny thumbnail. And then once again, we get this fantasy image of Neil's, beautifully colored. I'm cropping it this way to show you Neil's thumbnail that exists. Anyway, Pan goes to sleep and the little girl is left to peek behind the door. Look at the coloring change. Look at the art change, the stylized monochromatic coloring, the panel design to take you into the kind of cliffhanger conclusion so that when you turn the page, you're hit by this incredible, beautiful image. Again, folks, this is just one of Neil's most incredibly illustrated, beautifully drawn masterpieces. Talk about eclectica. Well, you're looking at it, folks. Pan comes to rescue her at the end. And then, of course, you get to the end of the story. He's just stone, honey. Plain ordinary stone. Isn't that so? Yes, Daddy, I wish it weren't true, but he is just stone. And so it ended. Yes, dear reader. Judy had grown up. She walked away and she never looked back. And that's a pity, because if she had looked back, she might have seen something wonderful. Now, why the word balloon continues to the bottom of the page tells me DC had a half-page ad plan for the bottom, a third page of an ad plan, and it crapped out, and they had to put something down there. And just what a way to spoil one of Neil's most beautifully drawn endings. But that's the business, folks. Anyway, in one of my article interviews with Neil from Comic Book Marketplace that I went over in my overview webinar, but Neil talks about good coloring from bad coloring. But people know when they like something. Good coloring does make you like something. And you can see the page from Nightmare that I used. And on the right, that earlier story I showed you that was done in pencil and just beautifully colored by Neil. He follows that up with this cover, talk about great coloring, another Witching Hour cover. So, from Japan to your town, USA, another look at all the detail in this cover, folks. The dog, the Raggedy Andy doll. Neil was just, I don't want to say churning out these covers because, they're not churned out. But man, he could go from genre to genre, back to Hot Wheels. Now, I'm showing you these Hot Wheels because there's going to be a little Hot Wheels thing coming up, but Neil was obviously kind of getting into the Hot Wheels groove at the time. This will be the last time. He did one more Tomahawk cover after this, but I like this last one because it was Neil, I think, doing a subtle redraw of this old Tomahawk cover. It looks like by Russ Heath, I think, from the mid 1950s. And again, you can just see the dimension Neil brought to comics when he does his take on a similar scene, but switching sides, so to speak. Same month, over in House of Mystery. I mean, study the composition, the tilt, the coloring, the beautiful browns of not only the tree, but the woman's dress. And just compositionally, you know, Neil is developing these compositional themes. So you've got the figures on the left side of the panel, of the page, of the cover, versus the figures on the right side. The very next month, over in the Witching Hour, you've got the figure on the left side confronting the figures on the right. But man, how daring is this cover? Remember I told you green was one of Neil's favorite colors, but there's a green masterpiece. And just the willingness to commit to that much black space is just really awesome and beautiful. Same month, we get this mechanized horror drawing. And man, Neil loved drawing animals. How about the dog in the foreground? Next month in Phantom Stranger. Again, you just got to study the subtle coloring choices, the halo around the Phantom Stranger shadow, again, green, key color. Just so much to love in all these covers. But then you go from, you know, the subtle image, really, that this is a quiet image. The very next month, Neil does one of his Superman covers. And you get all of the energy and intensity. And the same month, from superheroes to Westerns, Neil does one of his first Western covers other than Tomahawk. DC turned or resuscitated their all-star Western title. Now, nice black and white original here. Just study Neil's inking on that vest and all the different textures. You can even see the whiteout he used on the hat. But look at this sketch, probably done by Carmine Infantino, maybe, of what the cover might have been. And who knows who rejected it, but we got this instead. Same month. Another unexpected cover. And we have the black and white line art. Look at Neil just drawing animals in the same sensitive positions as his humans. That's a man who knows the insides. You know, in art school, we learned about drawing from the inside out. Neil was self-taught pretty much, but he drew from the inside out. November of 1970, the era of the woman in the Gothic setting with the haunted house in the background motif. In popular culture, this was a big thing. There were paperback covers galore of the woman in the dress with the castle in the background. And Neil did so many variations of it that some were, again, mini masterpieces like this one. Closing out the year of 1970 with one of Neil's very cool mezzotint covers, the screen in the background that would be shot by the printer from the black and white toned pencil drawing. Again, printer's jargon. The same month, though, Neil gives us this masterpiece. It looks like grease pencil. again, Neal and Animals and just the great hand. 1971 kicks off with another Western cover, but not only does Neal like drawing horses, but keep your eye on DC's Zorro knockoff, El Diablo, because you're going to be seeing a lot of him in Eclectica Part 2. Same month, from Western to science fiction. How about this cover, which should have been full bleed, but DC's style at the time was to cram the cover smaller with all of that trade dress and but man, look at Neal's beautiful black and white original. And the subtle tones there. Again, looks like grease pencil. This was another, I think, subtle knockoff of an old Gil Kane science fiction cover from the 50s, mid-50s. And just Neal doing his take on it. Same month, from science fiction back to horror, beautiful coloring of that sky. The green moon. Also in February, the same month, Neal gives us this Superman mini masterpiece, and the tones on Superman's body just give the figure so much dimension and weight, so you feel that figure falling. The same month in Phantom Stranger, another interdimensional crossover cover, which starts out an inked version that looks like this. Again, whether Neal rejected the figure or I think Dick Giordano was editing Phantom Stranger, but we wind up with this one instead. The same month, I know I keep saying that, but do you believe the same month Neal is doing a similar theme over in Flash, combining photography in the background with this interdimensional struggle? That's the best black and white version I can find. But folks, how about Neal's hand-painted color study that he did on a photostat of the black and white art to give to the colorists who were cutting the screens? I mean, to execute the complexity of that finished cover. And yes, folks, one more time, the same month. Remember I told you, keep your eye on Hot Wheels? Is that Santa Claus? Boy, this feels very, I mean, Family Guy has done a bunch of episodes, or maybe it's American Dad with the evil Santa, but why is this? Yes, a NEAL ADAMS interior Hot Wheels story? What the? Yep, the same, dimensional intensity, but yeah, applied to Hot Wheels. So Neal, just any genre, any type of art, any type of story. So even when the characters are more cartoony, Neal's trademark realism can't help but give even cartoony characters a three-dimensionality they never had before. And there's the trademark close-up of the eyes in the bottom left. Speaking of close-up of the eyes, how about this masterpiece? Of all of Neal's mezzotint covers. Now, what I mean by mezzotint, here is Neal's black and white original of the guy's face. Now, that looks like black and white ink with wash tone, maybe. But that's given to a printer to photostat it, but to shoot it through a mezzotint screen, which has that crosshatch effect to give it this finished look. Neal draws the bug with the skull head, obviously, on another layer, and the printer adds it, and that's how you get really just one of Neal's masterpieces. I keep saying that, but hey, Same month, folks, March of 71. Yes, we get the woman fleeing the Gothic mansion in space. Once again, why am I showing you Green Lantern, Green Arrow of March of 71 when I showed this in the Green Lantern, Green Arrow webinar? Well, what I did not show was this particular interior page. Notice the bottom right, editor's note, this page inked by Bernie Wrightson. Now, in 1971, Bernie Wrightson had not become a household name that he would garner very soon, but his style was unmistakable even from the start, this being one of his self-portraits. And I think Neal brought in this new talent like Wrightson and Kaluta. We're going to talk about these guys next webinar, but Neal, in a sense, tried him out. First on a page, then he let him ink one of his horror covers in April of 71. Look at Bernie Wrightson's signature down below. And then, of course, the coloring. Remember I told you Neal loved green, and this is just another subtly green cover. Speaking of subtly green cover, the same month, Phantom Stranger, with this Gothic cover of the four-poster bed and the beautiful green lighting. You gotta love it. April of 71 is followed by May of 71. But why am I showing you the cover of the May 2nd, 1971 New York Times magazine, which spotlighted a Joe Kubert cover of Sergeant Rock called Comic Books Become Relevant? Well, this particular story, remember, Sergeant Rock takes place in World War II, but this was a story, a roman à clef on the My Lai massacre of 1969 that didn't get reported until 1970, I think. And then the trial was in 1971, I believe. But that was Joe Kubert and Bob Kanigher's reaction to My Lai. This was Neal Adams. This little tome was written and drawn before the My Lai massacre. I had spoken to non-military types who were there, and I guess you could say this was my contribution in favor of getting out of that poor, sad place. The title is Greetings. For the uninitiated few, the first word you saw in your draft notice in those days was greetings. It's a black and white story that features some of Neal's most beautiful black and white line art. Young guy walking along, taking a hike, looks down at the ground and notices this object in the grass. He dusts it off, and could that be Neal Adams giving us the equivalent decades earlier of this item? Yes, because when you look at what happens when you turn the page, you get a view from without. Now, Neal said the title was Greetings, but when it was printed, it was called A View from Without. That's Neal Adams photographing himself as this alien to, as you can read the text there, is kind of reporting on the state of Earth, particularly on this region called the United States and eventually Vietnam. So pages 2 and 3 are Neal using photographs. And if you get the sense of the text, it's basically Neal laying out the situation as he knew it in 1971, from whatever research, the people he said he talked to, etc. And again, we can't spend time reading all the text, but it looks like a little overwritten description of, but that's not what this story's about, because when you turn the page, you start to see Neal drawing Vietnam up close and personal. So as you read the text here, we get the story of a Vietnamese family. And the husband goes off to war. Notice what Neal says here. His job is to ambush an enemy patrol. It is doubtful whether he really knows why he's fighting. I don't know whether Neil made it clear whether this was North Vietnam or South Vietnam. It doesn't really matter, I don't think. He literally gets his head blown off. Beautiful drawing of the Black American soldier. Neil obviously had photo reference for some of these pictures, but the way he would weave them together into this narrative. And remember, folks, this is 1971. Nobody's doing this in comics other than Neil. And nobody has the facility to draw children, and now babies, and not babies, but babies in war, babies maimed. I mean, once again, folks, when people talk about comics as film on paper, as you're seeing these panels the way I'm showing them to you, it feels like you're watching a film, and that's the mastery of Neal Adams. Nobody else would attempt to draw a child staggering to its feet. I mean, you've got to know how to draw, folks, to pull off both of these panels. Huh. What a contrast. And Neil, the great storyteller, knows how to pace a story so that when you get to the bottom right of the page, you then see the top of the next two panels. So the little video machine ends, the kid reaches into his pocket, and that's how the story ends. Now remember, Neil said in the beginning, the title is Greetings. This was in a fanzine, although it looks pretty professional, called Phase, issue 1 from 1971. So Neil was working not only above ground, but underground, alternative press, so much. I'm really only showing you the tip of an iceberg, but you know, from the guns of modern war to the guns of an old war. Now, it looks like the tonal value here, you can see in the black and white mezzotint version. I think Neil rejected this. It was a little maybe too mezzotinty. So he went with this tonal version, which eventually I think made it to the cover to look like that. Same month, over in House of Secrets, another woman in distress. But man, I just love the coloring in these, you know, the background tones, just beautiful. Same month, House of Secrets out in space, the haunted house in space. And man, look at the black and white inked original. Look at all the detail Neil puts into that house and how much color brings to this image. So let's get to the haunted house back on Earth, same month, over in Unexpected. And we have the black and white original here. And then maybe my single favorite Phantom Stranger cover, June of 1971. Now, folks, Neil's mastery of anatomy, of cartooning, you feel the force of that bang from the kid that it's having on, looks like the scientist in the lab coat. I love the digital Phantom Stranger. Talk about Neil being graphically ahead of his time there. Now, I did a sketchbook of Neil's work that was published by Vanguard. And here's one of the double page spreads. Now, I only have that black and white thumbnail, which again was probably the bottom half of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. But you can see how much Neal kept it and just rearranged the elements to get that cover. Next month, July, why again am I showing you a Green Lantern Green Arrow cover that I covered in the Green Lantern Green Arrow webinar? No, remember Bernie Wrightson? Well, after getting a page to ink and then a cover to ink, I think Neal said, okay, Bernie, you're ready for the big time. How about inking an entire issue of Green Lantern Green Arrow, which would be this issue? And you can see in the few black and white pages that exist, Bernie Wrightson's fine lines in inking Neal, while retaining the classic Wrightson brushstrokes on Green Lantern's hair in the bottom panel. How about this figure on this particular page? Beautiful, huh? This page almost feels gothic and lush in the way Wrightson inks these bottom two panels, but what a mesh of Neal's penciling prowess with Wrightson's sensitive brush. This was a month before, I'm sorry, same month. Wait, yeah, that was June, I forget. So Swamp Thing debuts in the July 71 issue of House of Secrets. But over at Marvel, a couple months before, their black and white magazine with the John Buscema painted cover, Savage Tales, May of 71, has an interior story written by Jerry Conway and illustrated by Gray Morrow called Man Thing. So Neal's Phantom Stranger cover, August of 71, comes a month after Wrightson's Swamp Thing and a couple months after Gray Morrow's Man Thing. But once again, you can see the beauty of the black and white line art and how much color. Another beautiful green cover by Neal. But Neal did a pretty good Swamp Thing, I'd say. October of 71, the thumbnail for this cover exists. Again, these are a quarter the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So the next month, remember, Neal's jockeying back and forth between DC and Marvel. So he does the first Red Wolf story, their Native American superhero. December of 71 ends with his second to last House of Mystery cover, Ghost Ship. And there's the mezzotint black and white plate that would go into the finished cover. Same month, Phantom Stranger. I love this cover. I love the daring use of pink and purple in the background and how not only is the Phantom Stranger there, but he's also casting that shadow. Meanwhile, at Marvel, the same month, this would become one of Neal's most iconic Marvel covers. And it's mostly for that Hulk and the giant foot. But I love the fact that Neal does his take on Doctor Strange, because we have these two sketches circa early 70s. I'm not sure exactly when these were done, but Neal did a pretty cool Doctor Strange, but he never really drew a story of Doctor Strange other than these images. The same year in 71, Neal would do this cover for Marvel Mania magazine, their prozine at the time. And it was pretty cool, these issues of Marvel Mania. Now, I forget what the story behind this cover was, what this was used for or not used for, but inside this issue, Marvel Mania would publish fan art. Now, this is the best resolution I have, but let's look closely at that Iron Man. And is that Arlen Schumer, 1970? Yes, folks. This was my first published piece of art. I was 12 years old in 1970. And I sent it into Marvel Mania, and they published it the following year. To think that my art debuted in print in the same publication that featured a Neal Adams cover just shows you that I was destined to not only end up working for Neal and loving his art and thinking of him as a father figure, but for it to end this particular webinar at the end of the year 1971. So folks, thank you very much. I'll just end it with my usual look into my website, arlenschumer.com. I'm a comic book style illustrator and comic book and pop culture historian. My website is split up into separate pages, like my comic book history page that tells you how to get a signed hardcover that I'll also sketch in for you of my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. There's really no other book like it that features the art the way I do. I even take out the original word balloons and put the artist talking about the art. I also run 3 Facebook groups about comic book art history. One on the Silver Age, one devoted just to Jack Kirby's work, and of course, one devoted to the artists who influenced me and really an entire generation of fans who became artists. I developed my style doing comic book art for advertising and editorial usage. And one of my specialties is turning people into superheroes and keeping the photographic likeness. My website's also linked to the commercial site TeePublic, where you can get over 100 of my images in every type of application and thingamabob and gigaw and etc. So support your local freelance artists. If you go to my lectures and webinars page, there'll be information and links to both my YouTube channel and my Vimeo channel that house videos of my live lectures and my webinars. Now, my Vimeo page has all of the webinars that feature copyrighted content that YouTube's lawyers are a little more strict and they flag. So they're over on Vimeo. And my YouTube channel has most of my webinars and previous live lectures. You can see on the top row there are all the recent previous Neal Adams webinars. I'm posting each previous one like a week later. Folks, I also do webinars for New York Adventure Club. So coming up in 2 nights on Friday, June 17th at 5:30. If you don't know who Vivian Meyer is, I maintain she is the greatest photographer of the 20th century. So come and find out. That's a ticketed event, but if you can't make it live, buying a ticket gets you access to the recording of the webinar for a week. And then my Neal Adams Memorial webinars, of course, will end next week with Neal Adams Eclectica Part 2, which features some of the fun characters you'll see in this montage that I put together. So go to my events page where I post all of my comings and goings and all of the descriptions and URL links you will need. So folks, thanks again, once again, for coming to this one. And I hope to see you next week for Neal Adams Eclectica Part 2. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.